For the benefit of my colleagues who are waiting in line to introduce their amendments, we had 45 minutes in this amendment. We will not take it that amount of time, or probably considerably less than half of that. Mr. President, in offering this amendment with Senator Specter, I believe we have gotten, the reason why we offered it is I believe we have gotten off track on welfare reform, and we need to return to a bipartisanship on this issue and, quite frankly, on many others. So this amendment is the text of the only bipartisan welfare reform bill that has been introduced in this Congress, and the only bill that President Clinton has promised he would sign. That's not to suggest the only bill he will sign, but it's the only one he's promised he would sign. And the only bill that I'm aware of that's gotten relatively wide editorial support from the leading papers in the country. My colleagues will probably know it as the Castle-Tanner Welfare Reform Bill. I frankly like to call it the Biden-Specter bill because Senator Specter and I did introduce it on the Senate side, but the heavy lifting on this bill and the drafting of the legislation was done by Congressmen Castle and Tanner. It is perhaps appropriate that everyone know it as the Castle-Tanner bill, as I said, because they did the heavy lifting, and they did a first-rate job. Before talking about the substance of the proposal, I want to briefly review how we got to this point of offering the amendment. Last September, the Senate passed the bipartisan welfare reform bill by an overwhelming majority, as my colleague Senator Specter had indicated, and we, along with the vast majority of our colleagues, voted for it. Since then, however, we've been faced with gridlock, politics, and paralysis. Both sides of the aisle have been using welfare reform as a political football, and we have accomplished nothing thus far. So last April, Congressman Castle and John Tanner, Congressman Tanner and several other moderates from both parties in the House decided to leave the bickering behind, sit down and write a bipartisan welfare plan. This amendment is that bill. There is nothing shocking hidden in this bill. It's all been out there before. A block grant to the states, a 5-year time limit, work requirements, child care, and child support enforcement. But the genesis of this particular amendment is that it is bipartisan and has been from day one. Let me mention just a couple of differences between this amendment and the underlying bill. But before I do, I want to compliment my senior colleague from Delaware, Senator Roth, for the changes that he has made in the bill in the Finance Committee. When I introduced the Biden-Specter bill or Castle-Tanner bill in the Senate last month, the differences between the Finance Committee proposal and what we are proposing today were much larger than they are today. There is still, in my view, much room for improvement in the so-called leadership bill, and I believe we should still go forward with the bipartisan bill. But I do want to recognize Senator Roth's effort at accommodating some bipartisan changes. Some of the major differences that remain, one we settled just a couple hours ago that's in the Biden-Specter bill, and that is the child health care safety standards to ensure that kids are being cared for in a safe environment. We accepted that amendment. I guess we voted actually on it overwhelmingly for the amendment to become part of the leadership bill. Second, the Biden-Specter bill provides states with additional funds to set up work programs because, let's be honest, getting welfare recipients into jobs is going to cost a little bit of money on the front end. And third, the Biden-Specter bill allows, not requires, but allows states to provide non-cash benefits for those who reach the time limit so that states have the flexibility to design a program that meets the needs of the children in their state. An amendment which is independently introduced by the distinguished senator from Louisiana and just discussed to be voted on tomorrow. Fourth, Biden-Specter would not allow food stamps to be converted into block grants so that the ultimate safety net, ensuring that all Americans have food on the table, will not be taken away. And fifth, the Biden-Specter bill would retain for all families, not just those who are below the poverty line, the transitional medical coverage, Medicaid coverage, where those who go to work can keep their health insurance for 1 year, because it is acknowledged that the vast majority of them in that first year will not go to jobs that in fact have health insurance available for their children. You know, welfare recipients are not stupid. They know that most of the jobs will not have any health insurance for their kids. And if we really want to move them off of welfare and onto work and not just onto the streets, an extra year of health care, in my view and the view of the bipartisan group, is critical. And the sixth, the Biden-Specter bill says that anyone who wants to receive welfare must sign an individual responsibility contract so that they are forced to agree up front to the conditions placed on receiving the benefit, and so that they will have a plan from day one on how to get themselves off of welfare. Again, Mr. President, these are not all the differences that exist in the bills, but they are among the most important. Now, I know that every member of the Senate will be able to find something that he or she does not like in the Biden-Specter proposal and all others' proposals. I can do that too, and it's my own amendment. But the point is this: if we really want welfare reform and not a political issue, we must do it in a bipartisan way, and each of us compromise, and do it in a form the President can sign. This amendment fits that bill. It's the only bipartisan welfare reform bill to be introduced in Congress. It's a bill the President said he would sign, and it's a bill that's gotten wide editorial endorsement, and a bill that makes compromises by definition of it being bipartisan on both sides. I don't like the idea that we are block granting this and it is no longer an entitlement. But in return for that, one of my Republican colleagues agreed that they would in fact come up with sufficient dollars for health care, the one-year transition. They would come up with money for child care in the legislation and so on. So it's a genuine compromise that I think is a solid proposal, because we've all been saying for a long time. I introduced a concept of workfare in 1986. I remember being pilloried by my colleagues on the Democratic side at the time for suggesting that there be mandatory work requirement for anyone receiving welfare. Well, we've all sort of come to the same general proposition. The issue is, are kids going to be left out there? Are women going to be able to go to work, or those single fathers be able to go to work knowing that there is no reasonable prospect to anyone to take care of their child, not have daycare? And are they going to make that judgment to do it knowing once they do, they're going to lose their Medicaid, which is translated health care for their children, going to a job where they will not get health care for their children? It seems to me if we really want to get people to work, this is not just about money, although the Biden-Specter bill is estimated to accommodate savings of $51 billion. $51 billion. But that's only one of the purposes, I thought, of this legislation, this change. We hear speech after speech after speech about changing the ethic that is involved in, quote, the welfare syndrome. We just heard our good friend from North Carolina talk about the generational nature of this problem and how to break the spiral and so on. Well, part of that is to, in fact, not just take people off of welfare and put them on the streets, but put them to work and make them want to go to work and make it reasonable for them to go to work. And so I would respectfully suggest that it's not just about money. It's about changing attitudes. It's time to say that we do not care who gets credit for reforming welfare. It's time to just do it in a bipartisan fashion. And for the sake of the American people and for the sake of the people on welfare, I would urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan Welfare Reform Act. And depending on what my friends on the other side have to say in opposition, I would reserve the balance of my time. But